rain had started just before dusk, soft at first, then steady and relentless, like a quiet dirge over the rolling hills of Dorset. Ashford Manor stood cold and regal at the edge of the moors, its ivy-covered stone walls whispering secrets to the wind. The gas lamps inside burned low, casting a buttery haze on the rain-streaked windows, and somewhere deep in the house, the grandfather clock struck 7. That was when the screaming began. By the time the housekeeper, Mrs. Prowse, had reached the east wing, the screaming had stopped. The drawing-room door was locked. She knocked, calling the name of her employer, Lady Violet Ashcombe, and when there was no answer, she summoned the groundskeeper to break it open. Inside, the sight that met them would stay etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. Lady Violet, the iron-willed matriarch of Ashford Manor, was dead, sprawled unnaturally across the chaise lounge beneath the oil painting of her late husband. Her head lolled to one side, eyes wide open in terror, and a single white rose had been placed delicately in her folded hands. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. The windows were locked from the inside. The only key to the door was in the keyhole. On the inside, no one could have entered or left without being seen. And yet, she was dead. The Ashcombe staff searched the room feverishly, but the only clue they found was absurd in its simplicity. A page torn from a gardening almanac, dated 6 months prior. It lay on the floor beneath the edge of the chair, entirely out of place in the stately drawing-room. There was nothing written on it, just the day's weather and some planting advice for camellias. The police arrived just after nightfall. Chief Inspector Craddock, a blunt and meticulous man from the county office, led the investigation. He ruled out suicide almost immediately. There was no poison in the room, no ingestion, no sign of self-harm. And besides, Lady Violet was not the type. The medical examiner found no obvious cause of death, though he promised further analysis. The body bore no wounds. The expression of terror on her face, however, was undeniable. The staff were questioned. No one had seen anyone enter or leave. There were only 4 others in the house that day, aside from the staff. All were women, all widows. All had known Lady Violet for over 2 decades. The press, when they caught wind of it, called them the 6 widows of Ashford Manor, Lady Violet having been the 6th, now deceased. Miss Jane Marple heard of the affair 2 days later over a quiet breakfast at the vicarage in St. Mary Mead. It was the headline that caught her attention. Mysterious death at Ashford Manor, no sign of entry or exit. That and the curious mention of the gardening almanac. She arrived uninvited at Ashford Manor that afternoon, under the polite pretense of being a distant cousin of Lady Violet, a white lie easily smoothed over by her age, her demeanor, and her uncanny ability to be underestimated. Chief Inspector Craddock, who had encountered her once before during a peculiar case involving poisoned marmalade, gave her a skeptical look, but allowed her to stay, if only to humor her. "Locked from the inside, you say?" she asked gently as they stood in the drawing-room. The air still held the faint scent of old perfume and fireplace ash. "That's correct," said Craddock. "Windows latched. No secret passages, we checked. The door had the only key, and it was still inside when we broke it open." "And the rose," she murmured, looking down at the dried bloom in the evidence bag. "From the garden, most likely. She kept a white rose bush in the eastern courtyard. Symbolic, perhaps. Sentimental, but meaningless without a message." "And the almanac page?" Craddock shrugged. "Completely irrelevant, I suspect. Likely left by accident." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just slightly, though her face remained serene. "Nothing is ever truly irrelevant, Inspector. Not in a murder." She asked to see the house, not the grand halls or the servants' quarters, but the paths between rooms, the route from the kitchen to the drawing-room, the small, unused sunroom that led to the courtyard. She noted the creaking floorboards, the thickness of the carpets, the drafts in the walls. She asked odd questions about heating systems and whether the fireplaces were all functional. At first, the staff answered awkwardly, uncertain of her purpose, but Miss Marple had a way about her, quiet, persistent, always observing. That evening she took tea with the remaining 5 widows. They were gathered in the green salon, a cavernous room with tapestries and high-backed chairs. None of them seemed particularly shocked by Violet's death. Sad, yes, but not surprised. That struck Miss Marple as telling. Violet was always rather formidable, said Mrs. Constance Blackwell, a tall, dour woman with sharp eyes and a widow's brooch pinned to her collar. I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone decided to stand up to her. You believe someone murdered her? Asked Miss Marple mildly. There was a silence. Well, said Mrs. Lillian Fairfax, wringing her lace gloves. She did have enemies, didn't she? Even amongst us, perhaps. We were all close once, but time changes things. It does, Miss Marple agreed, though I find that old grievances have a way of lingering. Mrs. Dallow, the youngest of the widows, sipped her tea with trembling hands. She threatened to cut me out of the will, she said quietly. She told me so last week. I laughed, but she wasn't joking. And she wasn't joking, muttered Mrs. Sutherland, a woman who walked with a cane and wore perpetual disapproval like a second shawl. Violet always got her way. Miss Marple said nothing. She listened. She observed. And that night, as she sat in her guest room, staring at the almanac page, a small smile crept to her lips. It wasn't random at all. It was misplaced. Someone had gone through great effort to create a perfect locked room illusion, using familiarity with the house, knowledge of the routines, perhaps even timing the grandfather clock to mask their movements. But something had gone slightly wrong. A page from an old almanac had fallen from a pocket or sleeve. That meant premeditation, and that meant the crime, however impossible it seemed, had a very human culprit. Miss Marple turned the page over, examining the faint smudge at the edge. A trace of wax, perhaps. She glanced at the fireplace. No candle had burned there in months, but someone had used one recently. She rose, wrapped her shawl tight, and crept back toward the drawing room, moving silently through the hall. The manor groaned and sighed in its sleep. As she neared the fireplace, she knelt, inspecting the hearthstones. There, a faint scorch mark beneath the grate beside the andiron. She tapped lightly, hollow, a panel, clever. Miss Marple smiled again, soft and pleased. Locked room mystery, indeed. Miss Marple did not touch the panel. She rarely disturbed what she hadn't fully read. Instead, she sat back on her heels, surveying the grate as though it were an old acquaintance trying to conceal a guilty secret. The soot along the edge was fresh, faintly disturbed. Someone had been here very recently, but not to burn anything, rather to access something. A hidden compartment in a manor this old was not unusual. What was unusual was that no one had mentioned it, not the staff, not the police, and certainly not the widows. She stood slowly, careful not to scuff the rug. The house was quiet now, resting uneasily under the watchful eye of death. But somewhere in its bones it still whispered. The following morning, Inspector Craddock found Miss Marple already seated in the breakfast room, a delicate teacup in hand, and her knitting, never far, resting serenely in her lap. "You were up late," he said, eyeing her with a curious blend of wariness and resignation. "I do find sleep difficult in unfamiliar places," she replied with a soft smile. "One's mind tends to wander. But tell me, have your men discovered anything further about the rose?" Craddock sighed and slid into the opposite chair. "Picked fresh, same variety as in the garden. No fingerprints, of course. As for cause of death, we've got nothing conclusive. No toxins, no trauma. Pathologist thinks it may have been a rare cardiac event. Natural in theory, but that expression on her face. I've never seen terror like that outside a war zone. Fear can be a powerful weapon, Miss Marple said gently, especially in the hands of someone who understands it. He frowned. You think she was frightened to death? I think, she said, setting her teacup down, that fear was the instrument, not the cause. She made her way once more to the drawing room after breakfast, this time accompanied by Mrs. Prowse, the housekeeper. The woman had a proper bearing, rigid spine, hands clasped before her apron, mouth a tight line of habitual restraint. You've served Lady Violet for how long? Miss Marple asked lightly as she examined the window latches once more. 21 years, Mrs. Prowse replied, since just after her husband passed. And the other widows, frequent visitors. The housekeeper hesitated, only slightly. Yes, they all met during the war. Volunteer relief efforts became close, though things changed over the years. Changed how? They became more polite, Mrs. Prowse said after a pause, and polite people don't say what they really mean, Miss Marple. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Very true, Mrs. Prowse. Tell me, was Lady Violet afraid of anything? The woman glanced around the room, then leaned in slightly. She wouldn't admit it, but she hated the fireplace. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She'd never sit near it. Never let us light it, even in winter. Said it gave her dreams. A faint frown deepened. And once, a few years ago, I caught her burning a letter in it. She jumped like I'd struck her. Thank you, Mrs. Prowse, Miss Marple said, with sincere warmth. You've been most helpful. That afternoon she walked in the rose garden. The rain had washed the leaves clean, and the sun, now weakly shining through parted clouds, caught the glint of dew on petals. The white rosebush stood tall and proud along the eastern edge, immaculately pruned, its base freshly raked. Too freshly. She crouched, brushing aside some soil near the roots. Nothing disturbed. But she noted a heel mark nearby, a woman's, narrow, pointed, not belonging to the gardeners. Back in the house she asked after the guests again. All 5 widows remained, though 2 had expressed intentions of leaving the next day. Miss Marple visited each under some pretense or another, inquiring after Lady Violet's favorite flowers, requesting embroidery thread, asking after church arrangements. But what she was really watching was how they moved, who avoided her gaze, who flinched at the mention of the rose, and who asked nothing in return. Mrs. Constance Blackwell, for example, showed not the slightest interest in the investigation. No questions, no theories, no curiosity. A woman who'd been friends with Violet Ashcombe for 20 years and had nothing to say. And then there was Mrs. Dallow. Miss Marple found her in the music room, plinking nervously at the grand piano, barely playing chords. You knew Violet the least of the group, I gather, Miss Marple asked, settling beside her. Yes, said the younger woman. She was kind to me at first, then less so. She called me naive. Said I reminded her of someone she once trusted and shouldn't have. Did she ever speak of what happened during the war? Mrs. Dallow looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Only once. She said the 6 of them had made a promise, something to do with a man. Ah, said Miss Marple softly, fingers moving idly over her knitting. And was it a good promise or a bad one? Mrs. Dallow blinked. She said it was necessary, that if any one of them betrayed it, the others would respond. Miss Marple nodded faintly. She rose to leave, then turned. Forgive me, have you ever owned a dog, my dear? Mrs. Dallow looked puzzled. Number Y. Just a stray thread I'm following, Miss Marple said lightly. Later, while Inspector Craddock updated the station with his latest reports, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to the fireplace again. This time she used her knitting needle to probe the faint gap beneath the hearthstone. With a soft click, the panel shifted slightly, revealing a hidden drawer, small, ash-lined, and carefully sealed. Inside lay a bundle of letters. She didn't remove them, just noted the wax seal, broken and stained. One letter had been opened. The others remained tied with a ribbon. She saw names, Lady Violet's, yes, but also the rest. Constance, Lillian, Dallow, Sutherland, and Fairfax. The bundle was addressed in a firm, masculine hand, to be opened only upon my death. She replaced the drawer carefully, sealed it again, and stepped back, her heart quietly beating faster. This was the hinge of the story, the point everything turned on. She now suspected Lady Violet had been holding something over the other women, something tied to a man long dead. The fireplace, the fear, the letter burned in secrecy, the rose laid out like a message, a promise broken, a punishment delivered. But who? She was still pondering this when she passed through the gallery hall and noticed something odd. One of the framed photographs along the wall had been recently moved, by mere inches, but enough to disturb the dust line. She adjusted it, and as it settled into place, a corner of paper slipped out from behind the frame. It was a funeral notice, dated 6 weeks ago. Gareth Edwin Linley, beloved husband, loyal friend, fallen soldier, interred at St. Jude's Parish, Hampshire. The name meant nothing to her, but when she brought it to Inspector Craddock and laid it on his desk, he went quite still. Linley, he murmured. That was her first husband's name. Violet Ashcombe wasn't always Ashcombe. She was married before. Miss Marple inclined her head. I rather thought so, and it would seem, dear Inspector, that Gareth Linley did not die in the war as she claimed. Craddock looked up at her, suddenly pale. Which means someone had a very good reason to keep him dead, even now. Miss Marple's eyes were bright and unreadable. The question, of course, she said softly, is who? Craddock stared at the funeral notice, lips pressed thin, knuckles white around his teacup. So Lady Violet's first husband, Gareth Linley, didn't die in 1919 after all. He only passed 6 weeks ago. At a small parish, no obituary in the national press, no mention in her recent correspondence. You'd think a woman would mark the death of her first love. Miss Marple folded her hands, calm as ever. Unless, of course, she didn't mourn him. They sat in silence a moment longer, the manor settling around them like a sleeping beast, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that its secrets were stirring. Then Craddock exhaled sharply and stood. We'll speak to them, all 5, one at a time. I want to hear exactly what they say happened that day. He began with Mrs. Lillian Fairfax. She was already dressed for departure, her suitcase waiting in the vestibule, her demeanor unusually brisk. She entered the library where Craddock and Miss Marple waited and sat without invitation. I've already told the police everything I know, she said, smoothing her gloves. I was in my room the entire afternoon. Lady Violet had retired to the drawing room, as was her custom before supper. I didn't see or hear anything until the commotion. I certainly didn't go near the east wing. Craddock nodded. You were seen walking in the garden around 4. The gardener mentioned it. Her eyes flicked just for a moment. I took a brief stroll, yes. I forgot. It was only for air. Miss Marple smiled gently. The roses are very fine this time of year. I noticed some footprints, narrow heels, freshly pressed into the mud near Lady Violet's favorite bush. Mrs. Fairfax's jaw tightened. If you're suggesting I picked that rose. Not at all, Miss Marple said lightly, merely noting your presence. One often sees more than expected while walking among flowers. Craddock cleared his throat. Do you know the name Gareth Linley? There was a silence. Mrs. Fairfax's composure cracked, barely, but enough. Her lips parted, then pressed shut again. Finally, she said, "Of course. He was Violet's husband. Years ago." "Funny, then," said Craddock, "that his funeral was 6 weeks ago and no one mentioned it." She rose swiftly. "Are we quite finished?" They let her leave. Next came Mrs. Constance Blackwell, tall and unbending as ever, her dark dress buttoned to the throat, expression unreadable. She answered each question with clipped precision. "Yes, I was in the library alone." "No, I didn't hear anything unusual. Lady Violet rarely made a sound when she moved." "No, I never met Gareth Linley. I know only what Violet told us, that he died before she married Lord Ashcombe." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Violet once said you were the most dependable of her friends, her confidant." Constance's eyes did not waver. She was mistaken. "I was dependable because I kept her secrets, not because I wanted to." Craddock blinked. "That's an interesting distinction. She had power over us. Violet didn't share out of affection. She shared out of calculation." "And what precisely," Miss Marple asked gently, "was she calculating?" Constance hesitated, then, almost imperceptibly, she shuddered. She was afraid, not of someone hurting her, but of something being revealed. After she left, Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "They're dancing on glass, all of them." "Some dance because they're afraid of falling," she replied softly. "Others because they already have." Mrs. Sutherland came next, leaning heavily on her cane, face drawn and pallid. She sat slowly, eyes flicking to the teapot, then away. She was cruel in her way, Violet, kind in public, cold in private, but we all tolerated it. We owed her something, you see. "Owed her what?" asked Craddock. "A silence," she said, voice cracking, "from the old days. Something to do with Gareth Linley?" Mrs. Sutherland froze. "He was not a kind man. Violet didn't love him, not in the end. But she didn't kill him either, if that's what you're wondering. He died of pneumonia, or so the certificate says." "You've seen it?" Miss Marple asked, watching her closely. "No," she whispered. "But she told me. I believed her." "You all seem very loyal to her," Craddock observed. Mrs. Sutherland looked at him bleakly. "We weren't loyal to Violet. We were loyal to what we did together, to what we covered together." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Craddock, then back to the older woman. "Mrs. Sutherland, when Gareth Linley died, did Violet contact you?" There was a long pause. "She wrote a single line. 'The past is waking,' that's all." They helped her to her feet and watched her shuffle away. By now, Craddock's temper was fraying. "Every one of them is lying, or at least omitting. They're protecting something, or someone." Miss Marple didn't respond at first. She was staring at the teacups, 3 guests, 3 untouched cups. "They all say they were apart, but none can confirm the other's whereabouts, and none has asked, not once, how Violet died." Craddock blinked. "You're right." Miss Marple gave a thin smile. "That's the problem with deception, Inspector. It forgets to grieve." They called for Mrs. Dallow. She entered timidly, looking even younger than her years, eyes wide and full of remorse. "I didn't do anything," she said as she sat down. I knew something was wrong." "What was wrong, Mrs. Dallow?" Craddock asked. "She was scared. Violet, she told me not to trust the others. She said they'd smile at me and sharpen knives behind my back." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she tell you why?" Mrs. Dallow nodded slowly. "She said they made a choice, years ago. Something happened during the war, something with Linley. She didn't give details, just that she regretted covering for them." "Covering what?" "I don't know," she burst out, trembling. "But she started keeping records, journals, letters, old correspondence. She said if anything happened to her, the truth would be in the house. Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged a look. Do you know where she kept these records? Mrs. Dallow hesitated. She had a locked cabinet in her bedroom. I saw her once with a key on a ribbon around her neck, but when she died, the ribbon was gone. After she left, Craddock sat heavily in his chair. So Violet knew they might turn on her. She began preparing for it. And someone, Miss Marple said softly, ensured she wouldn't speak. There was one more left, Mrs. Lottie Harrington, the quietest of the group. She had been largely unnoticed thus far, always at the edges, polite but unremarkable. She entered last, a pale shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and sat with her hands folded like a schoolgirl. You haven't said much, Mrs. Harrington, Craddock began. I've been listening, she replied softly. Everyone wants to explain. I thought perhaps someone would tell the truth. And have they? No, she said simply. Miss Marple leaned forward. Then perhaps you might. Mrs. Harrington looked down at her lap. He didn't die in 1919. Gareth, Violet told us he had. But in truth, she had him committed. He came back from the war broken, violent. She hid him in a private sanatorium in Wales. We all knew. And you agreed to the deception? Craddock asked. We had no choice. If it came out, it would have ruined her. And us. Our reputations, our families, so we all signed an agreement. A pact. We'd lie forever. But he didn't stay locked away, Miss Marple murmured. Mrs. Harrington's voice dropped. He escaped. Last winter, he came to see her, threatened her. She paid him to disappear again, but I think she knew he wouldn't stay gone. Miss Marple rose slowly, a cold stillness settling over her thoughts. And so she prepared, not out of guilt, but out of fear that one of you would decide silence was no longer enough. Mrs. Harrington looked up, eyes wet. We were wrong to keep the secret, but we didn't kill her. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. Number but one of you did. She left the room with her knitting draped over her arm and her gaze fixed toward the eastern wing. In a locked drawer behind the fireplace, under layers of dust and years of deception, there was a truth waiting, and Miss Marple intended to find it before the sun set again. The manor had grown colder with each passing hour, not from weather but from the quiet tightening of the noose around truth. Miss Marple moved through its rooms like a wisp of smoke, always present but never intrusive, knitting in hand, questions on her tongue. Outside, clouds gathered low above the hills again, pressing the sky closer to earth, as if even nature anticipated something was about to break. After the interviews, she returned once more to the hearth in the drawing room. Craddock joined her, hands in his coat pockets, watching in silence as she gently pried open the hidden panel once again. Inside, as before, were the letters, but this time Miss Marple examined them in earnest. The opened one was addressed to Lady Violet in Gareth Linley's hand. She read it silently, lips barely moving. You promised me protection. You swore they'd never find me again. But now you write of regret, of exposure. You forget who you're dealing with, Violet. I remember what you all did. If I burn, you burn with me. And I swear, if you go to them, if you even hint at that night, I'll drag the truth into daylight. Consider this your final warning. Miss Marple folded the letter with steady hands and placed it back. So, Craddock said softly, he was blackmailing her. More than that, he was threatening to unravel a pact the 6 women made, something they did or covered up during the war, and Violet, whatever her reasons, had reached her limit. She was ready to expose it. Miss Marple nodded faintly. I believe so. She may have even started to, keeping these letters, reaching out to Mrs. Dallow, writing that cryptic note to Mrs. Sutherland. But someone stopped her. Not Linley, he's dead. one of the others. Craddock frowned. Each of them had motive, self-preservation at the very least. And opportunity, Miss Marple added. They were all here. Each of their stories has inconsistencies, and yet no theory explains everything. Not yet. She walked slowly back to the center of the room, eyes lingering on the spot where Lady Violet's body had been found. The chaise was still there, fluffed anew by staff, its brocade cushions too pristine. Let us consider then what each woman stood to gain, or lose. She began with Mrs. Sutherland. She's ill. She said as much, though she didn't need to. She likely has little time left, but perhaps that's exactly why she feared Violet's betrayal. If death is near, reputation is all that remains. Craddock nodded. She could have seen Violet's conscience as a final cruelty, one last betrayal of the pact. Indeed, but she seems to regret the pact itself. Her words to me weren't guarded, they were mournful. Not our killer, then? I'm not so sure yet. Then there's Mrs. Dallow. The innocent? The least connected, youngest. But Violet trusted her enough to confide in her. That alone makes her dangerous to the others. You think someone tried to frame her? Miss Marple considered it. Number if they had, we'd have found the almanac page in her room, or the rose. No, she's being watched, not framed. If she starts to recall too much, she becomes inconvenient. But she's not dangerous yet because she doesn't understand what she knows. And Mrs. Fairfax? Miss Marple's eyes darkened. She's a mask, composure and silence. But her reaction to Linley's name, it was too quick, too prepared. She had something to hide, and it wasn't just fear of Violet. Could she have had contact with Linley? More than possible. She could have been the one he reached out to first. Perhaps she was the one sending him money after he left the sanatorium. That would explain her desperation now. If Violet was about to expose everything, Fairfax's involvement would come out too. Craddock paced to the window, arms folded. We still don't know what this incident during the war was. No, Miss Marple agreed. But we're close. The motive lies at its heart. Then there's Mrs. Blackwell, cold as stone. Too cold. That woman knew how to bury emotion. And you saw she never once referred to Violet by name. Always she, never Violet. Distance like that only comes from betrayal. Perhaps Violet did something unforgivable, or perhaps Blackwell did. And Mrs. Harrington, Miss Marple paused. The only one who told the truth. Craddock turned. So she's innocent? She's honest. That's not the same. They fell into silence, the fire unlit between them. Somewhere in the manor a door creaked open, a footstep creaked. The house was settling again, or stirring. Miss Marple suddenly stood and walked out. Craddock followed. She led him not to the drawing-room or the garden, but to the upstairs hall where the bedrooms of the widows were arranged in a slow curve along the gallery. She stopped outside Mrs. Fairfax's door. It's time we look at her room. Craddock didn't object. He knocked once, no answer. She had gone for a walk after tea, claiming she needed air. The door opened easily. The room was immaculate, every surface polished, every object placed with surgical precision. Miss Marple, ever respectful, moved delicately, eyes scanning. She paused at the writing desk. In the drawer she found a set of correspondence neatly tied with twine. Letters, receipts, travel records, all addressed to one location, a boarding house in Cardiff. She looked up at Craddock. The sanatorium Linley was kept in is just outside Cardiff. She was sending money. Craddock exhaled slowly. So Fairfax was funding his silence. Miss Marple's brow furrowed, until Violet stopped her, or worse, threatened to reveal her part in the deception. They replaced everything. As they left, Miss Marple touched the side of the desk. her fingers coming away with a faint smear of wax. "I believe we've found our candle user," Craddock nodded grimly. "But what about the almanac?" Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. It was a decoy, a clever one. Violet knew someone might kill her. I believe she planted it herself. An irrelevant page from a harmless book to lead the killer into thinking she hadn't yet found the letters. A trap of sorts. They walked back down to the main floor, the day stretching toward evening now, the air heavy with rain that hadn't quite come. When they entered the salon again, the widows were gathered, silent, watching. Mrs. Fairfax stood near the window, her silhouette sharp against the gray sky. Miss Marple looked at her and said quite calmly, "You knew he was alive. You kept him hidden. And when Violet threatened to speak, you realized she'd take you down with her." There was a stillness in the air like the moment before thunder. "You had motive, you had access, and you knew about the fireplace, because you helped her hide things there before." Mrs. Fairfax's face did not change, but her fingers twitched. Craddock stepped forward. "Why the rose?" Fairfax spoke, her voice brittle. "It was Violet's symbol. She always left one in the library after each meeting, the six of us. A signature. I thought it poetic." Miss Marple gave a sad smile. "You wanted her to know it was personal." "She betrayed us," Fairfax hissed. "We all swore that none of it would come out, and now it's all unraveling." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "you never asked why she changed her mind." Mrs. Fairfax blinked. "Because she knew someone would stop her," Miss Marple finished. "She didn't want justice, she wanted proof, and someone to find it." Craddock turned, quiet urgency in his voice. "We need to open that cabinet in her room." Miss Marple nodded. "The ribbon's gone, but the key may yet be near." And somewhere in Violet's room, behind the last locked door, waited the truth. But even now, they could feel it. The motives were deeper still, tangled in a web of loyalty and fear. And the past, long buried, was about to speak again. The key was not around Lady Violet's neck when they entered her room, as Mrs. Dallow had described. The ribbon was missing, and no sign of it lay anywhere on her dressing table, nor among her personal effects. Craddock swore softly under his breath, but Miss Marple was not perturbed. She moved about the room quietly, as if reacquainting herself with someone's private memory, her eyes settling on the things people forget to conceal: creases in a handkerchief, a button in a drawer, the scent of lavender on a shawl. The cabinet in question stood beside the writing desk, small and ornamental, locked with a simple brass keyhole and an aura of delicate secrecy, the kind of furniture made not to store clothes but confidences. Craddock retrieved a set of master keys from the station and returned minutes later, triumphant and impatient. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and with a soft click, the cabinet opened. Inside there were documents, letters, newspaper clippings, a bundle of ration books, 2 diaries bound in green leather, and at the bottom a narrow folder marked Private G.E.L. Craddock opened it. Miss Marple said nothing, watching his eyes scan back and forth, widening slowly as he turned each page. "Good Lord," he muttered. This is it. She kept everything." And she had. In Violet's elegant, restrained hand, the entire story had been laid out. Gareth Linley had returned from the war unrecognizable, cruel, erratic, paranoid. Violet, already estranged from him, had concealed his condition to protect her family's name. When his violence began to spill outward, threats against nurses, aggressive behavior toward neighbors, Violet had turned to her closest friends. The 6 women, each bound by wartime grief, by secrets and unspoken dependencies, had agreed to hide Gareth's illness. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. They arranged for his placement in a private sanatorium under a false name, paid for quietly, kept off all records. The forged death certificate had been the final seal. But guilt, of course, never dies. Miss Marple read over Craddock's shoulder. The final entry chilled her. He wrote again, demanded more, threatened exposure, said he'd come here. I've hidden the letters in the hearth in case I fail to contain it all, but I fear the others. Some have grown brittle with time. And Constance, she watches me. I no longer trust her. If I die, know it was not of natural cause. Craddock stood. This is it. We have the motive, the threats, the direct accusation. Constance Blackwell. Violet suspected her directly. Miss Marple gave a small nod, though her eyes remained on the entry. It seems clear, yes. And the rose, the almanac page, possibly planted to suggest someone else, or possibly symbolic, something from their shared past. Craddock wasted no time. Mrs. Blackwell was summoned at once. She arrived composed, but with a strange flatness in her eyes, as though some reserve within her had already been spent. He laid out the evidence, her visits to Violet, the letter, the journals, the entry naming her, her relationship with Gareth. To her credit, she did not deny the past. She admitted everything, that she'd helped conceal Linley's condition, that she had resented Violet's sway over the group, that she had visited the garden that day. But murder? I knew she was unraveling, she said quietly. But I didn't kill her. I wanted her silenced, but not like that. I wouldn't have placed a rose. I would have let her die in disgrace, not martyrdom. Craddock wasn't convinced. He pressed her harder, demanded her alibi again. She repeated it calmly. She'd been writing letters, then reading. No one could verify it. It was enough. By dusk, she was escorted to the station for further questioning. And just like that, the case seemed closed. The press came the next morning, uniformed and hungry. Murder at Ashford Manor solved. Prominent widow confesses past deception. The headlines blared. Even the staff began to breathe again, the tension draining from the hallways, the manor finally exhaling its grief. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea by the window, remained quiet. She did not attend the formal announcement at the station. She walked the rose garden instead, her footsteps soft in the grass. Something sat uneasily with her, not in Constance's confession, but in Violet's warning. Violet had feared Constance, but not just Constance. She'd used the phrase, I fear the others. All of them, and something else. Something buried deep in the language of that final entry. If I die, know it was not of natural cause. Not if I'm murdered or if someone kills me, but if I die. As if she hadn't expected to be murdered with violence, as if she feared something quieter. Miss Marple returned to the drawing room that evening, once more staring into the fireplace. The hearthstone panel was slightly ajar. The seal she had so carefully realigned was now imperfect. She knelt, fingers tracing the stone. A single fingerprint remained in the ash, too recent to be Violet's. Someone had returned. She checked the bundle of letters. One was missing. It was then that Mrs. Dallow entered the room, pale and breathless. They said Mrs. Blackwell's been taken in, that it's over. Miss Marple rose, brushing ash from her skirt. Is that what you believe, my dear? The younger woman hesitated, her eyes falling to the fire. She scared me, Violet, but she also protected me. I don't know what to believe anymore. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Did you come into this room last night? No, she said too quickly. Why would I? No reason, Miss Marple said gently, except that one of the letters was missing this morning. Mrs. Dallow's face paled. You think I think, Miss Marple said softly, that Violet trusted you enough to tell you things, and that perhaps she left something for you, something she hoped you would find after her death. Mrs. Dallow opened her mouth, then closed it again. Tears welled. She left me a letter. It was under my pillow the morning after. I thought it would be something kind, but it wasn't. May I see it? Reluctantly, the girl reached into her sleeve and produced a folded note. Miss Marple opened it. They will lie. Even now they will lie. But the truth is not in the cabinet. The truth is in what they didn't take. Look beneath the rose, not the one they left, but the one they forgot. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The garden! She was out the door before Craddock could catch up. In the fading light, she made her way directly to the eastern edge of the rose garden. The white rose bush stood solemn and still, its leaves trembling faintly in the dusk. She fell to her knees, pushing aside the soft earth. Craddock arrived seconds later. "What is it?" Miss Marple didn't speak. Her fingers found something, wooden, narrow, wrapped in waxed paper. She pulled it from the soil. It was a letter, sealed with Violet's signet ring. Inside was a single sheet. "If you are reading this, then I have failed to prevent it. Not Constance. Not Lillian. Not the others. It was never them I feared most. It was the one who never argued, who never spoke too loudly, who pretended to be the smallest voice among us, the most harmless of us all. It was always Lottie." Craddock inhaled sharply. Mrs. Harrington, Miss Marple, folded the letter, her voice quiet as thunder. She didn't lie. She told the truth, but she omitted one thing. She was the one who brought Linley back, and she was the one who made sure he disappeared for good before Violet could confess. Craddock looked toward the manor, a dark shape in the twilight. "She's still inside." Miss Marple stood, brushing her skirt. "Yes, but not for long." The air inside Ashford Manor had thickened by the time they returned from the garden, the scent of rain curling around stone corridors like breath held too long. The letter, Violet's final testament, remained clutched in Craddock's hand as he followed Miss Marple up the central staircase. Each step felt slower than the last, not from fatigue, but from the weight of realization settling into place. Lottie Harrington, quiet, unassuming, forgettable Lottie, who had claimed to be nothing more than an observer. She had worn grief like lace, delicate, ornamental, slightly too rehearsed. They found her not in her room, but in the music room, seated at the grand piano, her fingers pressed softly to ivory keys, though no music played. She didn't look up when the door opened. Miss Marple entered first. "Mrs. Harrington," she said gently, "I believe you've been expecting us." Lottie turned her head slightly. Her eyes were dry. "I suppose I have," she said. "You always do know in the end, don't you?" Craddock stepped closer, voice hardening. "You brought him back." Lottie's smile was faint, almost wistful. "I never let him go." For a long moment, the only sound was the creaking of floorboards as the house listened with them. "I wrote to him," she continued, fingers sliding across the keys without pressing, "for years, while the others forgot. While Violet carried on with her grand morality, she acted like he'd died, but she never burned his memory. She just buried it." Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, watching the woman, not judging her, only waiting. "You loved him," she said quietly. Lottie nodded once. More than she did. He wasn't always cruel, not before the war, before they broke him. "And yet," Craddock said slowly, "when he returned, he was dangerous." "So they said," she replied, "but not to me. He remembered me. I was the only one who visited. I brought him books, tea, told him stories. I was his anchor." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice softer now. "But Violet threatened that connection. She told you she would speak. She said she'd go to the police, expose us all, expose him. She even wrote to that dreadful man who ran the paper in town, told him she was preparing a statement. I begged her to wait, but she'd already decided we were all monsters for what we did. Said the truth needed light. She never told the others, Miss Marple said. No, Lottie whispered. She told me. The silence that followed felt endless. Craddock opened his mouth to speak, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her eyes narrowing. There's something more, she said. Lottie blinked. What do you mean? Miss Marple stepped around her, resting one hand gently on the top of the piano. You made it about Violet, about Linley, but this story doesn't begin in this house, or even in the sanatorium. She turned her gaze to Craddock. Do you remember a case in Wales 20 years ago? A nurse found drowned. No witnesses. No arrest. Craddock frowned. You can't mean... I do, Miss Marple said. Her name was Gwyneth Moore. She worked at the same institution Gareth Linley was committed to. Lottie turned sharply, her composure cracking for the first time. She was kind to him, Miss Marple went on. He became attached. But when she tried to establish boundaries, he reacted poorly, violently. It was hushed up. Then 3 months later, she drowned on her day off. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but there was no softness now. The death was ruled accidental, but a friend of the nurse, another attendant, kept a journal. She claimed Moore had been frightened. She had even written the names of a few patients she believed capable of violence. She let the pause stretch. Gareth Linley's name was among them. Lottie stood. Her hands trembled now. I know of that case, Miss Marple said, because I was visiting my cousin in the district at the time. I remember the whispers. I remember the fear. Craddock stepped forward, expression grim. You knew about the nurse, Mrs. Harrington. You knew, and you still brought him back. He changed, she hissed. He told me the others twisted it, that they punished him for things he never did, that Violet made him angry, that she encouraged the others to betray him. I believed him. Miss Marple looked her in the eyes. And when you realized he hadn't changed? Lottie shook her head. He didn't hurt me, never me. But he would have hurt Violet. She deserved it. The words rang too loudly in the room. She made him suffer in silence. She made all of us into liars. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, you silenced her. The quiet was immediate. I didn't poison her, Lottie said suddenly. There was no poison, no mark. I didn't touch her. Miss Marple turned to Craddock. Then perhaps the means was simpler than we believed. Fear, you said. The expression on Violet's face. Craddock frowned. You think she died of terror alone? No, Miss Marple said. I think someone ensured she felt that terror at the precise moment her heart could not take it. She turned back to Lottie. You wrote something, didn't you? A note from Linley? You made it look like he had returned, that he was coming for her. Lottie's lips parted, but no denial came. She was already frightened. You knew her heart was weak. You waited until she was alone, slipped the note beneath her door, or left it on her chair. Lottie's voice was barely a whisper now. It wasn't meant to kill her. But it did, Miss Marple said gently. They let her weep. No handcuffs, no dramatics, just a slow, quiet surrender. Craddock stepped outside to call it in. Miss Marple remained behind. She walked once more through the music room, her hand resting gently on the back of the piano bench. She had always believed evil rarely wore the face of cruelty. Often it wore gentleness, love even, the kind of love that clings not to truth, but to memory until memory curdles. Outside, the rain had finally begun, soft and persistent, like a benediction or a burial. The manor would sleep again soon, its shadows slightly thinner, its silence a little more honest. But the roots of this crime had grown in soil, far older than any diary or confession. This was not simply a matter of murder, It had been a matter of mourning too long and trusting too easily, and in the end it was not vengeance or greed that had killed Violet Ashcombe. It was remembrance, twisted into retribution. Miss Marple folded her shawl closer and followed Craddock out into the rain. The rain softened into a mist by morning, coating the lawns in a silver hush, as if the manor itself had been wrapped in gauze. The public, of course, believed it was over. The newspaper printed its final flourish. Widow confesses to long-buried truth in Ashford tragedy. The article was riddled with inaccuracies and triumph, none of which particularly concerned Miss Marple as she sat once more in the library, knitting in one hand and thought in the other. Lottie Harrington had confessed, yes, but only to part of the truth. A cruel deception meant to induce a heart attack, carefully planned and chillingly executed. Violet's heart had indeed failed her, but Miss Marple could not dismiss the feeling that something still rippled beneath the surface. There had been no poison, no weapon, and yet the room, the rose, the letter, none of it had truly matched Lottie's temperament. She had been consumed by emotion, yes, but not by manipulation. Someone else had shaped the scene, someone cooler. Miss Marple put down her knitting and asked the butler to summon Mrs. Blackwell. Constance entered minutes later, composed as ever, though her eyes now held a sliver of something new. Resignation, perhaps, or calculation. She had been released from the station the day before, her name cleared in the public eye by Lottie's confession. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the public eye often missed what mattered most. "I assume," Constance said as she sat, "that this isn't merely social." "No," Miss Marple said with her usual disarming calm. "It's about a question, one I can't answer alone." Constance tilted her head slightly. "Then ask it." Miss Marple looked up. "How did the rose get to the library?" Constance didn't blink. "Lottie, she said it was her idea." "She said it was Violet's symbol," Miss Marple replied, "but she never explained how she got one. The garden was wet that day. There were fresh heel prints in the mud, and they weren't hers." For the first time, Constance faltered, the air around her tightening like fabric pulled taut. "I believe you picked it," Miss Marple continued gently. "After Violet died, I think you entered the library, saw her lying there, and made a choice." Constance stood suddenly, face pale. "I didn't kill her." "No," Miss Marple said, "but you made it a murder." The silence was unbearable. "She died," Miss Marple went on softly, "frightened, alone, perhaps believing Gareth had returned. But it was still an ambiguous death. The heart gave out, yes, but from what cause? There would have been doubt, speculation, an inquiry, but then came the rose, the almanac page, the whisper of deliberate cruelty. You didn't cause her death, Lottie did, but you shaped the narrative. You're imagining things." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Perhaps, but there's one way to be sure. A little test, if you'll indulge me. One final thing." She reached into her knitting bag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. A delicate brooch in the shape of a rose, old and unmistakably familiar. She placed it gently on the table. "She wore this once, did she not?" Miss Marple said. "Only during council meetings when the 6 of you gathered." Constance said nothing. "I found it tucked beneath her mattress," Miss Marple said. "I thought at first it was a keepsake, but the needle pin had been removed and the clasp tampered with." Still no response. "So I restored it. It looks the same, but the clasp is wired, just lightly. When handled, it records pressure and temperature. Quite sensitive. An experiment, really." Constance stared at her, the expression in her eyes unreadable. "I've shown it to each of the widows," Miss Marple said lightly. "Lottie, Mrs. Fairfax, even Mrs. Sutherland. I told them nothing, simply asked if they remembered it. They all touched it." She paused. "But no one left a fingerprint." Miss Marple folded her hands. Except you. The silence snapped. You're lying, Constance said, voice low. Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. The device is very simple. It stores only one signature at a time. Yours is still active. Constance's fingers curled. Her eyes darted once, just once, to the door, the smallest fracture. I only meant to tidy things, she said, to protect us all. She was going to destroy everything. She was going to tell the truth, Miss Marple said. She framed us, made it sound as if we'd conspired to kill him. She protected you for 20 years, Miss Marple said, and when her conscience finally demanded she speak, you made certain her death spoke louder. Constance's voice thinned. Do you think it was easy to keep a secret like that, knowing we'd taken a man and erased his name from the world? You didn't erase him, Miss Marple said gently. You erased yourselves. She stood, signaling the constable at the door. As Constance Blackwell was quietly escorted away, Miss Marple gathered her things. The brooch, harmless, ordinary, and never wired, was returned to its cloth and slipped into her bag. Craddock met her in the corridor. I heard shouting. She revealed just enough, Miss Marple said. The rose, the almanac, none of it was Lottie's idea. Lottie frightened Violet. Constance buried her. But why not confess when Lottie already had? Because Constance believed she had already won. But lies, even old ones, are greedy things. They never stay buried. They walked back through the hall, quiet settling in around them. The manor, though still, no longer felt suspended in grief. The past had been loud, but it had spent its fury, and in the wake of that storm, the silence felt earned. Miss Marple stepped outside into the new sun, her footsteps light across the gravel. She didn't look back. She never needed to. The truth had already followed. Rain returned by dusk, a cold and whispering veil that clung to the windows of Ashford Manor like breath on glass. The storm had quieted something in the house, but it had not stilled it. Constance Blackwell's quiet removal earlier that afternoon should have marked the beginning of closure. Yet for Miss Marple, it only opened new questions, threads fraying where there should have been knots. In her room, she sat with a fresh cup of tea and the diary Violet Ashcombe had hidden away, the one from 1948, its pages stiff and yellowed at the edges. Miss Marple had only begun to read it in earnest after Constance's admission, thinking it might now confirm the deeper shape of things. But when she opened it again that evening, something felt off. The ribbon bookmark had moved. A page she remembered vividly, an entry about a visit from Gareth at the sanatorium. His mind, fractured, paranoid, was no longer there. She turned the pages slowly, methodically, not a missing page exactly, but a removed section, sliced cleanly along the spine, a surgeon's precision. 4 entries, gone. She rang the bell. It was Craddock who arrived first, still in his coat, damp from the walk over. They've begun interviews at the station, he said, lowering his voice. Mrs. Fairfax has retained a solicitor. Lottie remains in a state of trembling silence. Sutherland seems more relieved than shaken. Miss Marple handed him the diary. Look at the binding. Craddock frowned, turning it over. Someone's cut this. Since this afternoon, I'm certain of it. He looked up, sharp now. You think someone got into your room? I don't think they had to, she said. I left the diary on the writing table in the library when I went for a walk. It was under a shawl, but that wouldn't deter someone who knew exactly what to look for. Craddock sat. Who? Miss Marple sighed. It could have been any of them, couldn't it? Even staff. The story is cracking now, not just along guilt, but self-preservation. The truth was always shared between them, but not equally. Some carried it lightly, others— Her gaze fell to the fire. Others needed it gone. The entries that had vanished were the ones Violet had written during a critical time, the days after Gareth's breakdown and before he was officially committed. In them, Violet had described not only his erratic behavior, but a moment of terrible consequence. She remembered a single line. We should never have let her speak to him alone. Who "her" was, Miss Marple couldn't now recall, and the pages that might have told her were ash, perhaps already fed to the fire by a nervous hand. Craddock rubbed his temple. All right, we seal the library, question the staff. No one enters or leaves without supervision. I'm afraid that won't help. Why not? Because whoever took the pages won't stop at one piece of evidence. And she was right. An hour later, Mrs. Dallow came running into the drawing room, face white, breath broken. The letters, Violet's letters, they're gone. Miss Marple was already on her feet before she finished speaking. Together with Craddock and a housemaid, they rushed to the drawing-room hearth. The hidden compartment beneath the grate had been pried open again. This time it was completely empty. The letters, Gareth's threatening notes, Violet's written replies, every fragment of the past had vanished. No sign of forced entry, Craddock muttered, sweeping his torch over the panel's edge. They knew how to open it, same as before. Mrs. Dallow looked near tears. I passed this room just after supper. It was empty. I swear. Miss Marple gently touched her arm. You've done nothing wrong, my dear, but I need to know. Did you speak to anyone? Mention the compartment? I only told Mrs. Fairfax, she said softly. She asked where the letters had gone. I assumed she was trying to make peace. Craddock swore under his breath. Fairfax. She's under questioning, Miss Marple said, but that doesn't mean she didn't send someone. A solicitor? A maid? A niece? Anyone? Someone who could claim ignorance and be gone by morning. Miss Marple turned to the window. The rain had thickened into a curtain now, obscuring the garden beyond. She felt the stakes shifting beneath them, as if someone were dragging the very foundation of truth further and further out of reach. There's something else, she said quietly. Violet didn't just keep those letters. She annotated them. She had a system, dates, initials, shorthand codes. I noticed them when I first read the topmost letter. I didn't understand them then, but I suspect they mapped conversations, who knew what and when. Without them, we lose the timeline, she finished, and the means to prove collusion. Craddock sank into a chair. So we're back to words against words. Worse, Miss Marple said. We're back to silence. The rain kept falling. Craddock eventually returned to the station, grim and exhausted. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, the hearth cold now, the empty compartment staring up like a grave dug and then forgotten. She looked around at the bookshelves, the curtains, the vase of pale chrysanthemums on the side table. She thought about the pages that had vanished. The phrase, we should never have let her speak to him alone. The absence of that detail haunted her, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it implied. One of them had spoken to Gareth Linley after the others had decided he must be hidden. One of them had stood before a man crumbling into madness and tried to offer, what? Forgiveness? Redemption? And something had gone terribly wrong. Miss Marple rose and stepped toward the bookshelves, not knowing what she was looking for. Her fingers brushed spines at random, Marlowe, Eliot, Plath, until she came to a shelf of older volumes. A complete history of local records, perhaps left there by a previous owner. Parish registers, council proceedings. She paused. One volume was misaligned, slightly forward, tilted right. She pulled it out. Inside was a folded sheet of stationery, plain but watermarked with Violet's monogram. It was a letter addressed to Mrs. Sutherland. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. My dear Evelyn, I can no longer ignore what happened between you and Gareth in 47. I know it was you who saw him the night of the attack. I know you've carried that guilt in silence. I don't blame you. He was already lost by then. But if anything happens to me, and you remain silent, then all of it was for nothing. Please, do what's right." Miss Marple stood still, the storm pressing harder against the windows. So it was Evelyn Sutherland, the one who'd seemed most fragile, who had claimed to be too old, too tired to involve herself, who had said nothing of substance, and now had a reason to make sure no one else could. But this letter had survived, and now that it had, the silence would not hold. The storm did not let up. By midnight it had swelled into something near biblical, hammering the eaves of Ashford Manor and turning its gravel paths into rivulets. Thunder rolled with long, slow authority, as though nature itself had been listening to every whispered confession, every buried truth, and was not yet satisfied. Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing-room long, after the discovery of Violet's hidden letter to Evelyn Sutherland. The house had quieted around her, and yet the silence was not a restful one. It was the silence of something holding its breath. She read the letter again, more slowly this time, letting every phrase soak through her like damp wool. "You saw him the night of the attack. Do what's right." The implications curled in her stomach like smoke. Gareth Linley's disappearance may have been far more complicated than even Violet admitted. Evelyn Sutherland, prim, detached Evelyn, was no innocent bystander, and she had motive enough to see every trace of that night vanish with Violet. Miss Marple rose, her hands steady despite the heaviness in her chest. She tucked the letter carefully into her knitting bag and made her way down the corridor. The east wing had been darkened for the night, but she did not need light. Her feet knew this manor now like a childhood memory. She turned toward Evelyn's room and stopped. The door was open, not wide but ajar, just enough for a flicker of unease to pass through it like a draft. Miss Marple knocked lightly. No response. "Mrs. Sutherland?" She stepped inside. The windows were latched, the curtains drawn. The bed was undisturbed, immaculate in fact, as though no one had laid in it at all. The wardrobe stood slightly open, empty. The nightstand drawer, empty. The drawers in the bureau, all open, all bare. Craddock was called within minutes, summoned from the station by a breathless footman. By the time he arrived, soaked and visibly alarmed, the staff had been roused and the house sealed. "She's gone?" he asked, scanning the room himself. "Packed lightly," Miss Marple replied, quickly but not carelessly. "She ran." "Yes," Miss Marple said, but not out of panic. Craddock turned to her. "Then why?" Miss Marple hesitated, eyes returning to the unmade bed, the open wardrobe, the neat precision of a calculated escape. "She ran because she realized the walls were closing in, not around the others, around her." "Because of the letter," Miss Marple nodded. "It named her, not as a murderer, not directly, but as the one who saw Gareth the night something happened, something that changed everything." "An attack," Craddock muttered. "The nurse? The one who drowned?" Miss Marple shook her head. "That was earlier. No, this would have been at the manor, or nearby, something that happened after Gareth returned, before they locked him away. Violet hinted as much." Craddock paced, his boots wet against the rug. "All right, so Evelyn leaves, slips out while the staff are changing shifts, perhaps. That's one crisis." But he was interrupted. A scream, it echoed from downstairs, piercing, high-pitched and short, as if strangled halfway through. They ran. Miss Marple, Craddock, the footman behind them, down the main staircase through the south corridor toward the kitchens. Mrs. Fairfax was standing near the cellar door, her face white and mouth trembling. She pointed mutely down the stairs. Someone's down there." Craddock drew his revolver, signaling for the footman to stay back. Miss Marple followed slower, hand on the railing. They descended into the cellar, bare bulbs flickering along the stone walls, casting twitching shadows across shelves of preserved fruit and aging wine bottles. At the far end of the corridor, a side room stood open. Craddock pushed the door. Inside was a single low-hanging bulb and the unmistakable smell of smoke, and lying on the floor, collapsed beside a scorched pile of ash and blackened paper, was the housemaid, Margaret, Mrs. Sutherland's personal maid. She was unconscious but breathing, her palms red and blistered. Her eyes fluttered open as Craddock knelt beside her, checking her pulse. Miss Marple crossed to the burned pile. She knew before she touched it what had been destroyed. More letters, possibly pages from the diary, anything Evelyn hadn't had time to take with her. "Can she speak?" Miss Marple asked. Craddock shook his head. "She's barely responsive." "She was left here to die," Miss Marple said. "Smoke inhalation, maybe, but why take the risk?" Craddock looked grim. "Because Evelyn must have known Margaret helped her prepare, helped her pack. She was a liability." Miss Marple bent down slowly, her knees aching, and brushed aside the edge of the ash. Among the destroyed papers was a sliver of an envelope, the corner still intact, enough to read the name. Gareth Linley S.E.O. Ashford Lodge. Miss Marple stood up. She was communicating with someone on the outside, recently. "Gareth?" "No," Miss Marple said. "He's long dead, I'm now certain of it, but someone else has been acting in his name. Someone who wanted to keep that fiction alive, to keep everyone else fearful. Evelyn was part of it, but not the author of it." Craddock looked up. "You're saying there's someone else?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, someone with access, with knowledge, and with just enough detachment to remain invisible in all this." They returned Margaret to the infirmary, unconscious but stable, and by morning it was clear. Evelyn Sutherland had vanished into the storm, but she had not gone far. A hired car had been seen by the groundskeeper just after 10, leaving the west gate, a route rarely used. A second search of her room turned up a train schedule marked for Wales. Craddock issued a nationwide alert, and Miss Marple returned once more to the drawing room. There was only one question now. Who was orchestrating this from the shadows? The rose, the diary pages, the forged notes, the disappearance, all threads in a far more elaborate tapestry, and somewhere in that hidden weave, someone still believed they were winning. The manor had entered a strange lull, too quiet for calm, too still for closure. Evelyn Sutherland was gone, and with her, a portion of the truth that had refused to speak aloud, but the silence she left behind rang like a bell. Even those who had nothing left to hide began speaking more softly, stepping more carefully as though afraid to awaken something they'd kept dormant for decades. Miss Marple sat once again in the drawing room, the space where so many shadows had stretched long across the floor. Outside, the rain had at last dwindled to a fine drizzle, the garden heavy with damp earth and broken blooms. Somewhere beneath the manor's skin, the truth still stirred. She placed the scorched envelope fragment on the table. The name, Gareth Linley, was unmistakable, though the handwriting was too partial to identify. Still, it told her something essential. Someone was invoking the ghost of a dead man, for fear, for leverage, but not for sentiment. Across from her, Craddock returned with a thick file under his arm. "Telegrams from Wales," he said. "Police interviewed the station master near Brecon. A woman matching Evelyn's description purchased a ticket but never boarded. No sign of her since." "So," Miss Marple said softly, "she either never left, or someone ensured she never arrived." Craddock looked grim. "I'm beginning to think the murderer doesn't care who takes the fall, as long as the past stays buried." Miss Marple was still looking at the table, eyes unfocused. "I keep thinking," she said, "about the things that haven't changed." Craddock raised a brow. "Such as?" The way the dining room was always set with 6 chairs, the way Violet still used her council meeting binder, even after the meeting stopped. The way the rose bushes were always clipped, never overgrown. Craddock frowned. She liked order, ritual maybe. Perhaps, Miss Marple said. But it wasn't just Violet. The entire house obeyed that structure, as if all 6 widows were still present, accounted for. She paused. And then I thought of something peculiar, Mrs. Fairfax, when she complained about the library. Craddock's brow furrowed. I remember, she said it was never aired out properly. Exactly, but that was the strange part. The windows in the library had been opened regularly. I checked the sills, dry on the inside, damp outside. Someone aired it out from within, carefully, even during bad weather. So, Miss Marple said, her eyes sharpening. Who was using the library at night? Craddock stared at her. You think someone's been living in the house, hiding here? Not hiding, Miss Marple said. Staying, working, preparing. She rose, her movements fluid despite the age in her joints, and walked to the library's tall bookshelf near the north wall. Her fingers traced each volume slowly. Dust clung to most, but one, or rather one section, showed the faintest difference in shade. She pulled a book. Nothing, then another, still nothing. A third, History of Regional Land Disputes, creaked forward, revealing a panel behind it. A plain brass latch. Miss Marple pressed it. The panel clicked. Craddock stepped forward, astonished, as a narrow door opened behind the shelf. A staircase, stone, steep and winding down. Together they descended. The air grew colder, heavier. At the bottom was a small chamber, stone-lined, once likely a servant's cold larder, long forgotten, but it was no longer unused. There was a cot, a basin of water, an oil lamp, and a desk, covered in papers. Miss Marple crossed to it at once, careful not to disturb anything. Letters, dozens of them, addressed to Violet, to Constance, even to the Ashford Trust's solicitor. Most were never sent, but all were in the same hand, slanted, meticulous, and unmistakably male. Gareth Linley's, except it wasn't. Miss Marple lifted one sheet and compared it with the burned envelope fragment she had saved. The same hand, she murmured, but too precise, practiced. I think someone forged Gareth's letters over years. Craddock scanned the desk. Who would go to all this trouble? Miss Marple turned slowly, pointing toward the shelf. There, on the desk's edge, was a stack of housekeeping ledgers, and tucked between 2 of them, a notebook, more personal, covered in dark oilcloth. She opened it. It was a journal, not Violet's, not Evelyn's, but Margaret's, the housemaid, the one who had been found unconscious in the cellar. Only the first few entries were readable before the ink smeared or the pages were torn, but one stood out. He said no one would believe me, said they'd think I was just a servant. But I've seen him write the letters. He doesn't even hide it anymore. He told me to deliver one to Mrs. Harrington and another to Miss Sutherland. But I saw the drawer, the lockbox with old cards, council seals, even Gareth's signature copied 100 times. He says he's protecting them, that they'd collapse if the truth came out. I think he's afraid Violet's going to confess, and then it'll be too late for all of us. Miss Marple lowered the journal, her mouth drawn in a firm line. He wasn't just a butler, she said softly. Craddock stared at her. You think the butler? Mr. Alcott, she finished. He's been here longer than any of them, long enough to know where the bodies were buried, so to speak, and long enough to begin crafting his own version of events. Craddock said nothing for a long moment. Then, slowly, we need to find him. Now. They returned upstairs in haste, but the butler's quarters were empty. His coat and hat were gone, his drawer bare, and in the center of his desk was a single envelope, addressed, in that same slanted hand, to Miss Marple. She opened it carefully. Dear Madam, I commend your tenacity, but truth is a dangerous indulgence, especially for those who've built their lives on silence. I tried to protect them, to shield them from the disgrace that would follow. I failed, and now the truth must fend for itself. But do not think you've won. Some things are better left interred. Signed, G.L. Miss Marple folded the letter and handed it silently to Craddock. The final actor, she said, just exited the stage. But this time she knew exactly where the curtain would fall. The morning after Alcott's disappearance broke over Ashford Manor with brittle sunlight and the sharp post-storm chill that crept through stone walls and under bedroom doors. The staff moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, their hands lingering longer than necessary on silverware and banisters, as if trying to anchor themselves to anything still solid. Miss Marple sat at Violet's writing desk, the butler's final letter in front of her, beside the forged correspondence, Margaret's scorched journal, and the cold ashes of the truths he had tried to incinerate. There was no longer any question about who had orchestrated the false trail, who had manipulated the fear and silence of 6 women for over 2 decades. But the question that remained, the one that had driven every shadow and deception, was why. She thought back to the early days of the investigation, the rose left beside the body, the almanac page folded just so, the diary entries cut from Violet's journal. Each detail had been symbolic, deliberate, a performance. But for whom? Craddock entered, his coat draped over one arm, mud still drying on the soles of his boots. No sign of him. We checked the stables, the old servants' quarters, even the parish inn. He's vanished, just like Evelyn. He hasn't vanished, Miss Marple said. Not yet, but he doesn't intend to run far. He wants this to end on his terms. Craddock dropped his coat over the back of the chair. I don't understand it. If it was about money, there's no record. If it was revenge, then whose? Miss Marple looked up slowly. Tell me, do you remember the name of the nurse who died? The one Gareth allegedly drove to suicide? Craddock furrowed his brow. Mary Dobson. That's the name Violet recorded in the diary, but it was never verified. There was no obituary under that name, no local record of burial. That's what always troubled me. She reached into her knitting bag and pulled free a small envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph, faded, creased, and brittle around the edges. It showed 6 young women standing in a garden, sunlight on their faces, all dressed in the post-war fashion of the late 1940s. Violet was easy to recognize, as were Constance and Evelyn. The 6th woman stood slightly apart, thinner, darker-eyed. She wore a nurse's uniform, but there was something ambiguous about her posture. Half pride, half distance. I found this among Violet's personal effects, Miss Marple said. It was tucked behind a mirror. No caption, no date. But I believe the woman on the end was not a nurse. Not really, and certainly not named Mary Dobson. Craddock leaned in. You're suggesting she was someone else? Someone closer to the household? Miss Marple nodded. She was a sister, a half-sister to be exact. Craddock stared at her, lips parting slightly. Violet's, number Gareth's, and more importantly, Alcott's. There was a long silence, the weight of revelation pressing into the room like thick fog. Miss Marple continued. Alcott wasn't his surname. He came into service under a false identity long before anyone in the house realized who he was. He watched, listened, waited, and when his sister died, whether by suicide or something more sinister, he vowed to dismantle everything those women built. But why forge Gareth's letters? Craddock asked. Because Gareth was a convenient ghost, a shadow whose madness could justify silence, whose name could summon fear. Alcott used him as a symbol. By pretending Gareth was still alive, writing to Violet, leaving roses, sending warnings, he kept the women shackled by guilt. He needed them afraid. not speaking, not digging, not confessing. Craddock ran a hand through his hair. So none of it was about money. It wasn't blackmail. No, Miss Marple said quietly. It was grief, and grief's colder twin, obsession. She stood and walked toward the window. The garden below was beginning to recover from the rain, color returning to the beds of iris and rose. It struck her as unbearably cruel that something so serene could exist beside such sustained anguish. He believed they let her die, she said, maybe even pushed her, and when Violet began to shift, began hinting at confession, at exposure, he moved quickly. The rose, the almanac, the isolation. He wanted her death to look like a revenge well-deserved, and he wanted someone else, Constance, Lottie, even Evelyn, to take the blame. Craddock paced the room, jaw set. But why stay here for years? Why not take revenge and leave? Because he didn't want justice, Miss Marple said. He wanted control. And slowly, methodically, he built his own version of the truth, one where he held the power. Every letter he forged, every whisper of Gareth's return, tightened that hold. Craddock paused. So he lived in the manor in secret, maintained the illusion, managed the staff, watched them all from within. Even loved them in his way, Miss Marple added softly. That's what makes it so dreadful. I believe a part of him cared, not for them as women, perhaps, but as puppets in a story he felt bound to finish. Craddock's face darkened. He tried to kill Margaret. Yes, because she saw too much, and because, perhaps, she reminded him of his sister. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Craddock asked, "What do we do now?" Miss Marple's answer was quiet but unwavering. "We find him. Before his final act, he's too theatrical to disappear without a last word." And they did, just before dusk. Alcott was found by the gardener's boy, sitting on a bench in the walled garden behind the south hedgerow, where Gareth used to sit in the years before his mind unraveled. He didn't run, he didn't speak. He simply folded his hands and looked up at the sky. Craddock read him his rights. He made no protest, and when they led him away, he turned to Miss Marple, eyes hollow but composed. "I never meant for it to go that far," he said, "but when no one paid for what happened, someone had to remember." "You didn't remember," Miss Marple replied, her voice like spun thread. "You rewrote." He said nothing else. Later that night, as the manor finally slipped into its first true quiet, Miss Marple sat beside the cold fireplace and picked up her knitting once more. Not because she needed something to do, but because endings demanded rituals too. And this one, long buried, had finally been allowed to breathe. The fog returned the following morning, curling in low and pale over the grounds like a ghost not yet ready to leave. Ashford Manor stood still beneath it, the great windows blind and dark. Craddock had already left for the station with Alcott under guard. The quiet seemed almost unbearable now. There was no more speculation, no more circling of truths. Yet Miss Marple did not allow herself the comfort of finality, because there was still something missing. She sat alone in the library, the very room where Alcott had plotted his long deception, and looked again at the folded letter he'd left behind. His motives had been revealed, his grief exposed, and yet something about his surrender had felt too smooth, too rehearsed. He hadn't confessed to the murder, he had confessed only to the illusion, and Violet Ashcombe's death remained unsolved. The door opened quietly behind her. Margaret, the maid, stepped in, her left hand still bandaged from the cellar fire, her eyes sunken but clear. She held a small parcel wrapped in linen and tied with twine. "I found this, miss," she said, "in the back of the linen cupboard, hidden behind old bedspreads. It wasn't there last week. Someone must have put it there recently." Miss Marple motioned her closer. Margaret placed the parcel on the desk and left silently. The linen unwound to reveal a book, a copy of the poetic anthology, worn and margin stained. It was Violet's, but Miss Marple's breath caught when she opened the cover. Inside was a hollowed-out space cut into the pages, and inside that space, two objects, a small silver locket, tarnished but delicately engraved with a G, and a note written in a trembling hand. The note was short. "I fear Evelyn suspects too much. She's begun asking about the roses, about Gareth's locket. She thinks I've been in touch with him. But how could I? I'm not mad. I'm not. I gave the letters to Alcott. I trusted him. I think I've made a terrible mistake." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and rose. She knew now. The final piece had slid into place, not loud or dramatic, but quietly, like the last stitch in a seam. Violet had never truly believed Gareth was alive, but Alcott had led her to act as if he were, and when Evelyn began questioning that illusion, Violet became dangerous, not because of what she knew, but because of what she was about to say, and someone else in the house had been listening. She made her way down the hall, past the portraits and oak panels, and knocked gently on the west drawing-room door. It opened slowly. Lottie Harrington stood behind it, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her eyes already brimming with knowing dread. Miss Marple stepped inside without a word and placed the locket on the table between them. "You recognized it when I showed it to you in the portrait, didn't you?" she said quietly. "You knew what it was, because Violet gave it to you, told you to keep it safe." Lottie didn't speak. "I imagine," Miss Marple continued, "you asked her why she still held on to something that belonged to Gareth. I imagine you begged her to forget the past, but she couldn't. Not when Evelyn had started pressing." Lottie's hands trembled slightly, but her expression stayed composed. "You weren't trying to hurt her," Miss Marple said, voice almost gentle. "But you were afraid that she'd tell the truth about Gareth, about the vote the six of you took the night he was committed, that it hadn't been unanimous, that someone, Violet perhaps, wanted to give him another chance." Still no answer. "But it wasn't the truth about Gareth you feared most, was it? It was the truth about you, that you had been the one to speak to him alone, that it was you who gave him the address of the nurse who had helped him escape the sanatorium, that you, whether through naivety or kindness, had lit the match." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. She threatened to tell Evelyn, or perhaps she already had, and Evelyn, if she knew, could not be trusted to keep it quiet. "Violet never thought it would matter, but you did." Lottie finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want it to happen that way." Miss Marple said nothing, waiting. "She told me that morning, said she was going to confess to everything, even if it meant Evelyn turned on her, said it was time the silence ended, but she didn't understand what that would do to the others, to me. We've all carried it all these years. I kept the secret. I did what I had to do. But Violet, she was ready to throw it all away." "And so," Miss Marple said, "you prepared her tea, as always. Only this time you added something to it." Lottie lowered her gaze. "A sedative, that's all. I just wanted to calm her, but I didn't know she'd taken her heart medicine. I didn't know the reaction would be so fast." Tears welled in her eyes. "She collapsed before I even left the room. I panicked. I moved her to the chaise, tried to make it look peaceful, and when I saw the rose on her writing desk, the one Alcott had left, I placed it beside her. I thought it would confuse things, tie it to him." There was no rage in Miss Marple's voice, only quiet certainty. "But Alcott didn't kill Violet," she said. "You did." Lottie didn't nod. She didn't have to. Her silence was confirmation enough. "You could have come forward then, said it was an accident." "They would never have believed me," Lottie whispered. "Not after everything else." Miss Marple stood. "You may still have the chance to explain, but to the proper authorities." Lottie didn't protest. She simply stared at the locket as though it had become something far heavier than silver. When Craddock arrived to make the arrest, he found her exactly as Miss Marple had left her, seated in silence, the rain just beginning to tap once again against the windows of Ashford Manor. The rain returned that evening, not a storm this time, but a persistent, whispering drizzle that misted the windows and crept into the cracks of the old stone. Craddock had taken Lottie into custody, her quiet resignation unsettling even in its grace. The case, as far as the law was concerned, was closed. The reports had been drafted, the motives understood, and the web of lies finally untangled. And yet Miss Marple did not sleep. She sat by the fire long after the house had gone quiet again, her knitting untouched in her lap. The locket lay beside her on the arm of the chair, its silver surface catching the flicker of the flames. She stared at it, not with triumph, but with unease. Something was out of place, not wrong exactly, but unfinished. She had been trained all her life by observation, in gardens, in village churches, in parlor rooms full of gossip and secrets. You could always tell when something had been added to a story after the fact, when a thread had been stitched too neatly, and the confession had been too neat. Lottie had not known Violet's heart medication would react violently with a sedative. That was what she claimed. But Violet had not collapsed with confusion. She had not groaned or reached for help. She had been found seated upright, eyes closed, hands folded as if in sleep. There had been intention in her stillness, not panic, peace. Miss Marple rose and walked the halls again, drawn not by suspicion but by instinct, the same instinct that led her to recognize when a rose was too fresh for a room too cold, or when a diary entry was missing a date. She turned into the West Wing and stopped outside Violet's private writing room. The desk had been cleared, the drawers locked. But Miss Marple had the key now, entrusted to her by Craddock himself, who respected her conclusions far more than he let on. She opened the middle drawer. Nothing. Then the side. There, behind a stack of blank parchment and ink bottles, was a small brown envelope. It bore no name, just a wax seal, the imprint too faint to make out under the candlelight. She broke it open. Inside was a letter, not addressed to Evelyn or Lottie or even Alcott. It was addressed to her. "Miss Marple, I hope this never reaches you, because it means I have failed to contain the damage I have caused. But if it has, then you have undoubtedly found your way through the ashes. Gareth was never what people imagined him to be. He was not a monster, but neither was he innocent. He was unstable, brilliant, and cruel in ways too quiet for most to recognize until it was too late. What none of them knew, not Evelyn, not Constance, not even Lottie, was that I did see him once, after they committed him. He escaped the clinic not because of Alcott, but because I let him. I arranged it, paid for his journey. I believed he could heal. That time and distance would mend him. But he never returned. Not to the manor, not to me. He died in a fire in Dover under an assumed name. The authorities sent me the confirmation 2 months later. I buried it in the garden, and from that moment on I let the lie grow, because admitting the truth would have exposed what I did, that I released him, that the harm he caused after escaping was on my hands. The roses, the forged letters, the silence, they were all convenient. I let them continue. I didn't stop Alcott. I even fed his grief when it suited me. You will find, if you press, a box buried beneath the sundial. Inside it is proof, his death certificate, and a photograph taken by the coroner. I am so very sorry. I never meant to protect a murderer. I only meant to spare the living. Yours in truth and guilt. Violet. Miss Marple folded the letter with trembling fingers. So the final deception had not been Alcott's alone. Violet herself had been the architect of the first great falsehood. She had orchestrated Gareth's disappearance, not as a cover-up, but as a misguided act of mercy. When he died, she buried the truth, hoping no one would ever connect his death to what came after. But that meant... Miss Marple's eyes widened. If Gareth had been dead for over 20 years, then the nurse's suicide, the fear the women carried, it hadn't been triggered by his actions at all. Someone else had used his escape as a screen. Miss Marple hurried down the stairs, tying her shawl as she went. She crossed the garden in the drizzle, slippers soaking instantly through. The sundial stood at the center of the rose garden, slick with moss, its gnomon casting no shadow in the silvered fog. She knelt beside it and scraped at the soil with her fingers. Just beneath the surface, where the roots curled like secrets, was a rusted tin box. Inside, just as Violet had said, was a death certificate issued by Dover authorities for a man found in a boarding house fire, Gareth Linley, confirmed by dental records, and a photograph, burned, facial features marred, but unmistakably male. Miss Marple stood slowly, her fingers numb, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she now knew. The crime hadn't started with Violet's tea, or even with Gareth's illness. It had started with a lie told in love, and buried in fear. Violet had believed she could handle the aftermath. She had underestimated the others, what they would assume, what they would do to protect the version of events they had lived with for decades. And someone, perhaps Lottie, perhaps even Evelyn, had built their own guilt upon a foundation that never existed. The final twist wasn't about who had killed Violet. It was about why she had let it happen. Because Violet Ashcombe, shrewd and weary, had known the only way to release the others from their guilt was to let them believe they'd ended it. Miss Marple stood in the mist, the sundial behind her and the locket in her palm. No one had ever truly been innocent at Ashford Manor, but in the end, Violet had given them something close to peace, and perhaps, for her, that had always been enough. By the time dawn crept over Ashford Manor, washing the sky in watery gold, the garden was no longer just a garden. It was a graveyard of secrets, roots curled around lies, damp earth heavy with truth. Miss Marple stood by the sundial a moment longer, the rusted box now wrapped in oilcloth beneath her arm. She looked once over her shoulder at the great stone house. Its silhouette was peaceful in the soft light, every shutter and chimney in place, the ivy climbing steadily toward the roof. But peace had never truly lived there, only ritual, only control, and now both had finally come undone. She returned to the drawing room just as Craddock arrived. He stepped in with his usual briskness, his hat damp, the scent of early morning clinging to him. But he paused the moment he saw the look in her eyes. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I take it something's happened." Miss Marple handed him the letter. He read it silently, his mouth tightening line by line, until at last he folded it neatly and stared into the hearth. "She let him go," he murmured, "after everything?" "She believed she was saving him," Miss Marple said softly, "and perhaps, in some way, herself." Craddock sat heavily, hands clasped. "But then the suicide of the nurse was not his doing," Miss Marple said. "We assumed it was linked to Gareth's return because we were meant to. Violet had already buried the truth of his death by then. The tragedy of that nurse, whoever she truly was swept into a convenient narrative, one that made sense to everyone because it leaned on fear." Craddock ran a hand through his hair. "So Violet protected Gareth, and when that blew apart, she protected everyone else from the truth. She fed the lie to Alcott, allowed him to carry it like a torch, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of sympathy. Craddock frowned. Then why let herself die? Why let Lottie believe she'd done it? Miss Marple looked to the window, to the light rising over the treetops. Because Violet knew, she said, that none of them would forgive themselves until the weight of that secret was lifted. Lottie was already drowning in guilt. Evelyn had run from it. Constance buried it beneath routine. Violet chose to take the burden with her, and in doing so, she gave the others a kind of absolution, however imperfect. Craddock said nothing for a while. Then, "I don't suppose any of this will stand up in court." Miss Marple gave a weary smile. "That's rather beside the point now, isn't it?" He looked at her. "Do you want to release Lottie?" Miss Marple hesitated. "I think Lottie must still face the consequences of her actions. She did drug Violet's tea, even if her intent wasn't murder, and she tampered with evidence. But she should do so knowing the full truth, not just the story she believed." Craddock stood and nodded. "I'll speak to the Crown Prosecutor. There might be grounds for leniency." They walked the halls together one last time, the air lighter somehow, though the weight of what had occurred would never fully lift. Miss Marple paused before the great portrait of the 6 women that still hung in the upstairs corridor. Violet in the center, proud and composed, the others flanking her like shadows, their expressions unreadable, their secrets invisible to the canvas. "You know," Craddock said, "when this all began, I thought it was a simple inheritance dispute, another bitter old family guarding the silver." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, there was bitterness and silver, but nothing simple. They reached the front door just as Margaret came down the stairs. Her limp had improved, and the bandage was gone. She looked healthier, steadier, and when she passed Miss Marple, she gave a small, respectful nod, the sort that acknowledged something far deeper than gratitude. Later that afternoon, Craddock delivered the evidence from the sundial to the proper authorities. The death certificate, the photograph, and the letter sealed and entered into the case file. Officially, Gareth Linley was dead. Unofficially, he had been dead for years. That left only one loose end. Alcott. Craddock returned the next morning with troubling news. The prison transport van scheduled to move Alcott to a higher security facility had encountered an accident. The vehicle had been sabotaged, brake lines cut, a quiet side road chosen deliberately. No officers were harmed, but Alcott had vanished en route. Miss Marple showed no surprise. "He planned it," she said. "Of course he did. He surrendered only when he had the escape arranged. He wanted the illusion of closure, just as Violet had." "Any idea where he's gone?" "He's a butler by profession, anonymous by design. He could vanish into any estate in the country and live out the rest of his days polishing silver and setting dinner plates." Craddock scowled. "That's not justice." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "it isn't." But she knew justice had never truly lived at Ashford Manor. What had happened here was older than law, deeper than guilt or innocence. It was the slow unwinding of secrets long buried, a reckoning of ghosts not just with the living but with themselves. As she packed her small suitcase in her guest room, Miss Marple paused beside the fireplace. A thin layer of ash still lined the grate. She reached down and, with her fingers, drew a line through it, one clean stroke across the center, the last mark she would leave on this house. She departed just as the sun fell low over the hills, its light angling through the windows, setting the corridors aglow one final time. The widows of Ashford Manor would never sit together again. Their fates, scattered across cells, ledgers, and memories, would be debated in whispers and fireside retellings. But in the quiet that followed, when the echoes finally died, one truth would remain, the truth that only she had seen, that the line between villain and victim was not drawn in blood, but in silence. The carriage rattled steadily down the country lane, wheels humming over the uneven stone as Ashford Manor receded behind a veil of low-hanging mist. Miss Marple sat upright, hands folded over her handbag, her expression serene. But her eyes were not resting. They flicked now and then toward the hedgerows, the cloud-choked sky, the rising whisper of wind through the beech trees. She had left the house with the truth aired and accounted for, or so everyone believed. But not everything had settled into place. Even now, a single detail remained adrift in her mind, like a lone leaf refusing to fall. The roses. They had been so central at the start, one placed with reverence on Violet's lifeless chest, another found days later in the morning room, too fresh for its vase. Alcott had denied placing the final rose, though he admitted to many of the earlier manipulations. And Lottie had her own guilt, but that flower had not been among her tasks. It was assumed to be theatrics, part of the stagecraft Alcott had indulged in so long. But now, with everything laid bare, Miss Marple realized the final rose had no clear owner. It had appeared the morning after Violet's death. Quiet, deliberate, a gesture not of vengeance, but of farewell. The coach passed through the iron gates and turned east towards the village. The driver, a thick-shouldered man with sun-reddened cheeks, glanced into the rear view. "Back to St. Mary Mead, miss." "For now," she said with a small smile, "though I suspect it won't be long before something pulls me elsewhere." He chuckled and turned his gaze forward. Miss Marple tilted her head, letting her thoughts return to the sundial and the letter Violet had written. There was a tone of control in that letter, too precise, too self-assured for a woman on the brink of death. Even in confession, Violet had played the part of conductor. She had handed over just enough truth to clear her conscience, without betraying anyone too deeply. But there had been another name in the house's history, a seventh unspoken name, Mary Dobson, the nurse who had allegedly died by suicide. And yet, with Gareth confirmed dead long before that incident, the narrative of her death collapsed. No records, no obituary, no funeral, no family stepping forward, nothing. Miss Marple had searched archives before leaving, discreetly requesting records through her contacts in the ministry. A reply had arrived that morning, slipped under her door. There had never been a nurse named Mary Dobson employed at the clinic where Gareth was committed. The identity had been fabricated, but by whom? She remembered the photograph of the 6 women, young and smiling, in the garden. There had been a 7th woman there, partially obscured, standing at the edge. Not one of the Ashford circle and not one of the household staff, and certainly not a servant. Her posture had been proud, her uniform borrowed, perhaps. Miss Marple opened her handbag and withdrew a small, time-softened photograph. It was the same image she had shown Craddock weeks ago. She stared at the obscured woman on the far left, barely visible, a smudge of shadow, a sliver of cheek, the faint curve of a jaw. There was something familiar about it, not the face, but the presence. Someone who had walked lightly through rooms, someone who had listened more than they spoke. A knock on the glass startled her from her thoughts. The driver had pulled into the train station and was waving politely through the window. Miss Marple stepped out with her bag in hand, nodding a quiet thank you. The village station was quiet, the next train not due for 20 minutes. She walked to a bench beneath the awning and sat. It was then she saw the envelope, tucked beneath her seat. Not new, not dirty, but placed with deliberation, her name written across it in a flowing, unfamiliar hand. Inside, a single page. "You see far, Miss Marple, but not far enough. You searched for ghosts and found the ones meant to distract you. But the real ghost never left Ashford. She simply changed her name. The past does not die in gardens or tea rooms. It slips between names. It survives in stories. You've cut down the tree, but the roots remain. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from clarity. Mary Dobson had not died. She had disappeared, changed her name, vanished into the house or its orbit, perhaps as a servant, perhaps as a neighbor, perhaps as someone who had watched the unfolding drama from just outside the frame, the photograph. She pulled it out again, heart quickening. That seventh figure, just barely hidden. That was the missing piece. Not a victim, not a conspirator, a witness, or perhaps something worse. The train whistled in the distance, growing louder, the rails humming in anticipation. Miss Marple folded the letter, placed it beside the photograph, and slid them both into her bag. Ashford Manor was finished for now. The police had their closure, the manor its silence, the villagers their gossip. But the story wasn't over, not truly. Somewhere someone still carried the final thread, and sooner or later she would tug on it. Because mysteries, real mysteries, don't end in confessions or arrests. They end in understanding, and understanding, as she knew too well, is always just a step beyond what we think we've solved. The train pulled in with a hiss of steam. Miss Marple boarded, found her seat, and pulled out her knitting. A scarf this time, red. As the countryside began to slide past the window once more, she allowed herself the smallest smile. After all, wherever the past lingers, the future is never far behind.